I'm really sorry that Jim couldn't be here. You probably heard that he got the days wrong, as so often happens. You know, if we were on ships and it took us 6 months to sail from one place to the other, and we had to keep track of the monsoons, then we wouldn't have this problem of not remembering what time zone we're in. So maybe that's what happens when we're moving too fast in this world.
Yes.
Yes.
So no problem. We can meet Jim Sykes next time.
Great.
And he also agreed that we can fix another date, and he definitely wanted to meet our scholars and students.
Yes. Yes.
Very near future.
Yes.
Well, absolutely. I'm sure that's a priority. I have some slides. I'm not sure exactly how to. Oh, I have to present my entire screen.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, well, we'll figure that out when it's time. I'll let you begin if you'd like. Or is it just up to me? Do you want me to begin?
Just 1 more minute. Others also can join with us. We can start by 10:30 sharp Indian Standard Time, right?
No, it is.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, we can wait for another 1 minute.
Of course. We can wait as long as you'd like. In Indonesia, they call it rubber time.
Yes.
Time that's stretched.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell me, is this a class? Is this part of a class, or is it part of a research group, or exactly who am I speaking to? How come you all get to see each other so often and regularly?
Yeah, this is actually the programs, international lecture series jointly organized by the Department of History, PSMO College, and also the Bake-Jairazbhoy Chair for Indian Ocean Studies under the chairship of the Professor Ami, and also the HAJI Chair for Migration Studies under the chairmanship of the Dr. Shibinu, the head of the Department of Economics. We jointly organized this talk, and this is almost the 6th on this particular series. So you will going to face an audience, those who are research scholars, and also the graduate student, postgraduate student from PSMO College and other colleges under the Calicut University. And some of the research scholars, it's like Mark Arendha, and probably I can expect one guy, University Chicago, Ihsanul. So all are here. I'm sure that you are aware about this. You know that Ihsanul Ihtisam and all.
Well, yeah. I'm on this. There's a quite amazing WhatsApp group of a whole bunch of people who work on the Indian Ocean.
You're talking about the Tariq.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's lovely to see so much research that I realize I haven't read and I need to read. That's the exciting thing about about this field, is that just when you think that you have an idea about it, you realize that there's a place you know nothing about that really should have a place, and that there are a million scholars writing all of these things that you need to read. So you're always being confronted by your own lack of ability to encompass this vast space, but that's what makes it exciting.
Yeah, great. But unfortunately, Amy is missing from that group, that WhatsApp group, because Amy is not using WhatsApp.
I am now using WhatsApp. So tell me about the group and I will join it.
Yeah, definitely, Amy, definitely.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we just need an invitation. Sure.
Yeah. So the program is like, I will welcome you all. And after that, this particular session is presided over by Dr. Shibinu. And after that, we will move to the Julia Bale for your nice words. And after this Julia Bale talk, we will be moving for the open floor. There will be plenty of time for the discussion. And I'm sure that Julia is almost night time, 10 o'clock already. So we will be keeping this particular meeting for the next 1 hour. So I hope that everything will be fine for the next 1 hour. So let me do my duty. Just introduce Julia Bale is an assistant professor in ethnomusicology at the University of Alberta, where she writes about Southeast Asian music and archives and think about the places where ethnography meets the historical record. Before coming to Alberta, Julia was postdoctoral fellow on a European Research Council project at King's College London. Her book, Antiphonal Histories, Resonate Past in the Toba Batak Musical Present, University Press, is a musical history of interior Sumatra that ranges from Gong King ritual to Protestant sermons and Jimmy Rodgers. Julia's ongoing research project on East Timor, civic modulation, explore public music, the individual and the transnational institution in one of the world's newest nation state. She has also directed and edited Poets in the Living Room, a film on an archive of South Asian music making in Edmonton, Canada, documented for over 50 years by the famed ethnomusicologist Ragula Qureshi. So this is a brief introduction about our guest speaker today. On behalf of the PSMO College and on behalf of the both chair, Arnold Bake chair for Indian Ocean Studies and MK HAJI chair for Migration Studies, and on behalf of the all faculty members from the Department of History and the graduate and postgraduate student and research scholars from the Department of History and other disciplines, and the students, those who join with us from the other departments, I welcome you all to this wonderful session. And I welcome especially Dr. Professor, my dear Amy, the backbone of all these programs. And I welcome Mark Arenha, and I welcome other important dignitaries. And I give a special welcome to Julia Bale. Amidst of all these difficulties and busy time and odd timing, the Julia ready to accept our invitation. We, with a full gratitude and pleasure, welcome Julia to this wonderful platform. With this few words, I welcome you all, and I pass to the floor to Dr. Shibinu to preside over the function. Over to you, Dr. Shibinu.
Thank you, Professor Asif. Actually, I'm extremely happy over today's program because, as Hasib has said, this is a program jointly organized by two chairs of PSMO College. Bake-Jairazbhoy chair for Indian Ocean Studies and MK HAJI chair for Migration Studies. Actually, the two chairs are currently pursuing 5 research projects, especially on ethnomusicology, especially on music, especially on migration studies. And we are fortunate that we are going to publish 3 books also under these two chairs, especially by myself and Hasib sir. Together, we want one book has been Routledge has consented to publish one book and another book by Springer. So we are fortunate that the research work that we are carrying out under the chairs is one worthy contribution that we are contributing to the students. We are contributing to the migration fraternity, that we are contributing to the research scholars of ethnomusicology also. And another part is because of, as Hasib said, because of Amy ma'am's help, we are able to organize a series of lectures, very beautiful lectures. Actually, the discussions that are happening in these groups, this platform is actually worth mind blowing in the sense that the students are directly contributing much towards our research work as part of the knowledge they are gaining from this types of discussion. And one more thing, today I am very much thankful to Ami ma'am and Dr. Julia ma'am. Because we all had a discussion on the article that you have shared, especially the article co-written by Dr. Jim and Dr. Julia. Very beautiful article, a very beautiful article that pertains the entire socio-cultural aspects of the entire cultural synthesis of the cultural synthesis of India with the rest of the world. So what I'm telling you is, while we were organizing that discussion, many questions have come out, especially on the cultural merging and what has the contribution of Kerala towards that particular merging. I'm not going in detail because I want to be part of that discussion later, at the later stage after Ma'am Julia has will presented it. So I'm not going into detail. I'm once again thanking Ma'am Ami for giving us this opportunity, because this is a good platform, not only for the students of the chairs. Instead, so many scholars from outside, research scholars from outside, they are eager to attend this type of seminars, this type of discussions. So we are creating a platform for all of them because of the help of Ma'am Ami, and we are so thankful to Dr. Julia Ma'am, because even after her busy schedule, though Dr. Jim has some problems, some personal engagements, Julia has kind enough to attend today's function. I'm thankful to all of you, Ma'am Ami, Ma'am Julia and all, and I'm congratulating Dr. Hasib also, because being director of Bake-Jairazbhoy chair, he is eagerly organizing. He is very constantly keen in organizing a lot of discussions like this, and it's much mind-blowing to the students also. I'm thanking him also, and without elaborating much, I think Hasib sir, I would like to hand over the mic to Julia ma'am or Ami ma'am.
Yeah, fine.
Okay.
So over to you, Dr. Julia.
Okay, over to you, ma'am. With much respect, much happiness, I'm inviting Ma'am Julia for the discussion. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I have some slides that I'm going to run through, but I realize that I do presentations for scholars the way that I do presentations for students, which is I prefer to have slides with images and speak about them, as opposed to having slides with lots and lots of text, because the images, we all are equal in terms of looking at them and interpreting them, as opposed to me trying to tell you something. So I should begin, well, first I should begin by saying that I do tend to speak very quickly. So you just need to tell me to slow down, and I will try to do that, number one. Number two, you may have heard that the name Regula Qureshi, which I think people from India and South Asia know like the back of their hand, that this amazing scholar was here before me at the University of Alberta and still is here. She lives with her daughter in Edmonton, and I am going to hopefully see her next week. But I never would have guessed when I was reading Regula Qureshi's work as a graduate student that I would have had some research that would have been of interest to people who work in South Asia, because my research from North Sumatra and Indonesia, I had always thought as being so different from South Asia. This has to do, I suppose, with something you probably already know since we wrote this article. But of course, Jim Sykes and I were not the first people to say that we've not really, as a group of people, whether we're historians or musicologists, been assisted by our area studies cones. On the one hand, we have been, because, for instance, most people who know a specific research language and have had the benefit of working with people who all work on, for instance, South India or North Sumatra, we know that we can have a common language, we have a common understanding of the in-depth locality of our historical, anthropological, musical research. And that is absolutely important. Globalization did not dim for me the importance of that really detailed language-based knowledge of place. And yet at the same time that I can be talking about somebody like Nagore Shahul Hamid, which you know of, certainly, and which I know of, but only because I worked on the Indian Ocean, that we could think of these as being a part of Southeast Asian experience and South Asian experience, but not necessarily speak to each other, is actually quite ridiculous, considering that the saint himself, his sanctity was based on him moving across the oceans and bringing knowledge with it. So in some ways, these area studies cones are not particularly helpful for doing this type of work. And so I suppose that is the one thing that I realized quite quickly. Even more so when we think about bringing the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Western Indian Ocean together, because Jim Sykes and I would have assumptions that we would gain from thinking about the Bay of Bengal or Sri Lanka that would be entirely differently understood by somebody who works on the Swahili coast. And so what I would say, just to begin with, is that every time I get in conversations with people who work on the Indian Ocean, I'm always impressed by how much I do not know and how much it is impossible for one person to know. And that the only way to do this type of work is to do it collaboratively, to do it in conversation with people with specialties across the Indian Ocean, and to do it with humility. And that was one of the main reasons that I wanted to take this talk, because firstly, what is the point of writing about the Indian Ocean from Canada, where I am near no ocean, if the scholarship does not get to new scholars, particularly students, who actually live the experience of the Indian Ocean? So I'm very excited, especially at the later part of this hour, to get your experiences, to understand what listening to music and listening to the Indian Ocean looks like in your particular vantage point. If you have any correctives or additions or things that you want to be considered, I would love to hear your perspective. And that is why, I wanted to be here more than anything else. Because as you know, there's so much that you don't know unless you are in a specific place and speak to specific people. So I'm grateful that the steamship has been supplanted by the airplane, and I'm grateful to have Zoom to be able to speak to you now, because as I said, there's no way that one person can do the Indian Ocean or even two editors. The real thing is the ability to bring together all of the people in our Indian Ocean book, and through those people and that set of essays to convene a larger conversation in which the field grows as we get to know each other's work. So I'm going to try to get into my slides, but I realize I have to present my entire screen, and I'm in the middle of finishing an article on an entirely different thing about missionary work in 19th century North Sumatra by German missions. So I do not know what is on my screen, but it is going to be a mess. I think I probably have 20 tabs and windows open. So we're going to see what happens when I present my entire screen. I'm a little scared. I am going to allow you to observe my screen. Okay. I'm not sure what you can see yet. Okay, I'm presenting my screen. All right, here we go. Okay, so that's good, I think. Let's see if I can find what I need to find. You can tell me if you actually see what I think I'm showing you. So do you see the screen that says Sounding the Indian Ocean? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So I will back up. And this is where I want to start. This is a picture that I actually took at the Sri Singamuga Kaliaman Temple in Pulau Pinang, which is part of Malaysia. You might know of Penang, Malaysia. And I can tell you a little bit about this temple, if you like. I took the picture because it literally faces out into the Indian Ocean, and it was a particularly beautiful and auspicious temple. But there are interesting things about it as well, that I will have another picture from a different place in this compound a little bit later to show you. So this is my orienting image. I wanted to talk at first about how it was that Jim and I came to work on the Indian Ocean. And I do think that it is important that we both had considerable field work in our own specific places of scholarship. So my book is called Antiphonal Histories, and in it you can see the black, white, and red carving in North Sumatra, in the Toba Batak area. Actually, young children have black, white, and red wristbands that they use, their parents use to keep them safe. And that might sound familiar to you. I would not be surprised if there are some nodding heads. So this is my work in North Sumatra, and I will explain to you in a bit how this has brought me to think about specifically India, and also through it, the Indian Ocean. Whereas Jim, his book is called The Musical Gift. It's about Sri Lanka. And his work also not only connected with the scholarship of this area, with the linguistic demands, having to learn Sinhalese as well as some Tamil, but also being in a place and taking as our primary sources the lived experiences of musicians and listeners and people in a particular place. So I can't emphasize enough that the people who corrected and formed our ontologies, our understandings of what is important musically in these places are our teachers from North Sumatra, from Sri Lanka. And more than anything, that is the expertise that we are conveying through these books. But I began working in North Sumatra in 1996, when I think a lot of people maybe were not born yet. Jim is about my age. I can never remember if he's a year younger or a year older. But the point is that before we even began to embark on the Indian Ocean, there was the requirement that we did it by realizing that this is quite important to understanding the music and the experience of this particular place. Because if it had not been, then I don't think I would have necessarily have become somebody interested in the Indian Ocean. I might have written about Indonesian politics. I might have written about popular music mediascapes. But as you'll see, the topic drew me to think about the Indian Ocean. And that is actually a strength, because that allows me not just to understand the Indian Ocean through the body of scholarship that is developed about the Indian Ocean, but also to offer the perspective that you can only gain by working in one place on the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, and in my case, North Sumatra. Jim and I were both on the research project, the European Research Council project of Catherine Butler Schofield, who is a scholar who studies the Mughal Empire. And she's about to publish an amazing music history in which the sources that she reads, I mean, she reads Urdu, she reads Persian, she has an understanding, Brajbasa, she has an understanding of all of these sources. So look for that book, because it's going to be incredible. It turns out that she brought Jim and myself together on this project from our own vantage points, to think about how it's possible to understand the process in the transition to colonialism all throughout this Indian Ocean area, which included one study on the Awadh area in India, one study on the Malay world, and then a final study on the Indo-Malay world, so the interface between these worlds. And I headed up the Malay world, and Jim headed up the Indo-Malay case study, but we began to speak, and through this we became interested in coming up with this larger project. So this is the first view of what the book looks like. So we're going to be publishing this in I believe in November of 2023. And it includes a lot of articles from scholars all around the Indian Ocean, including many scholars who don't live in the US, Canada, or the UK. We have a scholar who lives in Sri Lanka. We have a scholar who lives in South Africa, who lives in the United Arab Emirates, etc. And the other thing I should tell you is that this is going to be open access. So once it's published, anybody may download it and comment and push back or learn from. All of these things are possible. So this is what the book is going to look like. All right, I thought I would bring you through Medan, North Sumatra, so you can understand how it is that I began to realize that even though I thought I was doing the work on a small isolated group in North Sumatra, I actually was doing Indian, well, you could call it Greater India work, or the Indian Ocean work, but it was very clearly connected to the interface between South and Southeast Asia, and connected to the vast maritime sphere of influence that connected the Sanskrit cosmopolis to the land beneath the winds, which is Southeast Asia. So here's an example. The area that I'm speaking about, if you can see North Sumatra, it's the one on the very left, the island on the very left side that's pointing out towards the Indian Ocean. I will be talking a bit about Islam, and if I were to talk about Aceh, I would be talking much more about Islam. One of my research projects is actually about Achenese poetry, and it's about the Shataria Tarika, or brotherhood, which is very much connected with Sufi metaphysics. And so at the moment, I'm thinking about the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of oneness, and Ibn Arabi. And you can do this by being in North Sumatra, as well as, I'm sure, by being in many places on the coasts of India, for instance, where this type of scholarship is as important. But I'm going to be talking about North Sumatra. This is my drum teacher, Guntur Sitohang. I met him in 1996, and he taught me how to play drums and understand Toba Batak musicality. Just a brief thing that you should know is that the drum that he's putting together is not played rhythmically. It's played melodically. So it's actually played almost like a gamelan is played, where the different tunes are played on differently pitched drums. There are 5 of them that hang together, and it plays a melody. But I wanted to bring it to something that very clearly made me realize how connected South and Southeast Asia are. This is something that is called a Bindu Matogu in Toba Batak. And you can see the lovely cooing bird right next to it. But this is carved into the traditional houses. What we're very clearly seeing is a yantra that I will show you in a bit where it comes from. You might be able to guess that this has to do with the 8 cardinal directions in the Toba Batak world. And you might recognize some of the directions as well. Uttara, Dangsina, Pastima, Purba come from Sanskrit, and we'll explain why that's important in just a bit. This is an example of the Bindu Matogu in what is called a pustaha. In Toba Batak, the K becomes an H, so this is a pustaha. And as you can see here, you can see the looped elements of the yantra, which are quite important, as well as these animals that are moving around it, which are called, you probably would guess, naga. I want you also to see that on the right, there's this star. And even in the middle of the Toba Batak area, which has been often described as animist, even though it very clearly has a Shaivite tradition in it, you have what is called the Star of Solomon, or the Seal of Solomon. And this has to do with Islamicate understandings of magic and efficacy. It makes sense that they're all together because this is meant to be a powerful thing. The word Bindu, I'm sure you know. And this is an example of Carl Gustav Diehl, who is an older scholar who worked with Lutheran missionaries in South India, who looked at these chakras, specifically the one at the bottom, and saw very clearly. This is from Mantrikam, so religious popular literature on healing more than anything, so kind of ephemeral literature, but very clearly you can see the connection between the 2 bindus. Here's an example of what this looks like in Toba Batak scripts. These scripts are used for divination. They're based, they're like Javanese, they're based on Dravidian scripts, actually, rather than Sanskrit-based ones. And you can see the Bindu Matogu up at the top. So very clearly, it became obvious that we were talking about knowledge that moved between South Asia and Southeast Asia. And of course, if you know anything about the Indian Ocean in the earlier period, before, for instance, the 9th century or the 12th century, you would know about the Sriwijaya, which is a very important maritime empire, in which there were connections with the University of Nalanda in India, in which Atisha, the saint who actually initiated Tantric Buddhism in Tibet, actually learned Mahayana Tantric Buddhism in Sumatra, and then brought his knowledge into Tibet. But what is interesting is that even though people recognize Shaivism, particularly Buddhism in Java, very few people actually asserted its importance in the Toba Batak area. They would say that it was what magicians knew, but it was not what real people knew. There was never any understanding of there being, bhajan or bhakti or regular offerings to these gods. And so this was diminished in importance, particularly when the missionaries came in and wanted to have the fiction that Toba Bataks were entirely untouched by any religion before Christianity came. Toba Bataks are now about over 90% Protestant, so the missionary activity had a very large effect on them. But if you dig a little bit deeper into the history of this area, you will see chandi or temples like this one, which is almost never visited anymore. But they are at the high water marks up at the riverine networks that would actually take the goods that made something like Srirajaya so important, the inland, the goods from the mountains down the rivers into the ports and then onto the trade routes. And so the idea is that these temples would govern the sanctity of that actual movement. This is an example of something that was misunderstood as being a mural of dancing girls at this temple, but actually what this is yaksha, or Dharmapala within the Tantric Buddhist universe. So those kind of scary, often what's the word? Club wielding demons who often protect the compass points. And so when I looked further into this, I don't think I have many more of this right now. I looked further into this. It is very clear, especially when you look into early texts, that not only is this a yantra, not only is it the movement of Indian knowledge and magical literature into the Toba Batak area, but very clearly that Bindu Matogu that I showed you, there are stories of it as being said to have turtles on the bottom and snakes, and being connected with the story of the churning of the Sea of Milk, which I'm sure many of you know about, and also, for instance, is very important in Angkor Wat, right, in Cambodia. So and understanding throughout Southeast Asia. This is almost forgotten now, and I did not know it before I started really working on the mantras and the yantras. The reason that this is important to me, of course, is because if you look at a yantra, you know that it is sounded and danced. It is connected to this understanding of the world built on sound. So this is just a very early example of how I realized very quickly that the Indian Ocean is important to my research area. And not only that, but Southeast Asians have this habit of talking about Hindu Buddhism. And then sometimes they put Sufism in there as well, if you think about that little star, which was by the yantra, without recognizing that that drives people who work on South Asia crazy, because how can you talk about Hindu Buddhism? They're very different religions with very different subspecialities. You can't just put them all together. It's important to actually have specific knowledge that comes from South Asia without privileging it as being the most important thing for understanding Southeast Asia. So it's a bit of a balance here. I'm going to move on to what I did not study when I studied this in North Sumatra, which is the presence of the actual Tamil community in North Sumatra. So this is something that this is a shrine to the Maria Velankani of a place on the Coromandel coast. And I'll explain this to you in a little bit. But this is a shrine that was built, and it was built because a Tamil Christian friar, priest, came on a mission from the Catholic Church, obviously, to North Sumatra to minister to Tamil people who lived in the city of Medan in North Sumatra. And by the way, who had a very, very underprivileged existence there. This community was brought in the mid-19th century to work eventually on tin and tobacco plantations through British indentured labor systems, or at least examples. And when the man who came, Friar James Bharathaputra, came to Medan, he recognized that there were many people who needed not moral support and social and physical support as well. And so he managed to create quite a large community of Catholic believers connected to Catholic worship, especially Marian worship, that was connected to Velankani, and apologizing for my pronunciation, on the eastern coast of India. So that is where he came from. So this is a laborer who is laboring to make the shrine beautiful. But as you can see, of course, it does not look like any Catholic church that I've ever seen. It is connected. It is a hybrid of both a Catholic shrine and a Hindu temple, and it is meant to minister to anybody who comes needing the healing power of Mary, which of course is exactly what happens on the coast, on the Coromandel coast of India, when you have people who are moving between, for instance, Nagaur and Velankani and other sites as well, all the way between. I realized, however, when I was working on this book with Jim, that even though I had spent a lot of time eating food in the Indian section of Maidan, that I had not really ever thought about how these people came here, what their experience was like, what their music was like, how they engaged with other populations in Indonesia. And so when we decided to write the introduction for the book, I spent a lot of time, only over 2 months, but I think I went to maybe 32 houses of worship, including Sikh gurdwaras and many temples, Chinese and Taoist houses of worship, mosques, all throughout Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And this was one of these. This is the Virgin Mary of Velankani. And if you know the story is that I believe it's in the 17th century. I need to check, but she appeared to some Portuguese mariners who were about to perish, and stilled the waves and allowed them to bring their ship to the coast. And as a result, she was venerated by people all throughout that part of India specifically. And so this is what she looks like when she is put into the shrine in North Sumatra. Okay, so I can talk a little bit actually more about that if you'd like later, but I don't want to go too much longer on that. What I realized, in addition to the older history about understanding Southeast Asia and North Sumatra as being connected to the Indian Ocean for a very long time, is that there are also new intensifications and circulations of religious imagination. So this, for instance, is an example of a replica of the Shwedagon Pagoda, which is, of course, a Theravada Buddhist stupa in Myanmar that was actually built on the grounds of North Sumatra and recognized by hundreds of monks who actually came from Myanmar. But what is interesting about it, this, by the way, is from the Shwedagon Pagoda itself. You can see the musicians up in the eaves of the temple. If you've ever seen Borobudur, which is the Javanese Buddhist temple, you can also see musicians there. Musicians go wherever there are temples, it seems. The interesting thing about this, however, is that if you know about the history of Buddhism in North Sumatra, or even Southeast Asia, island Southeast Asia, is that we have Mahayana Buddhism, we have Vajrayana Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism. We do not really have Theravada Buddhism in the way that you have in Tibet or in Sri Lanka. And so the interesting thing is that the people, the Buddhist Sangha that put together this Myanmar replica was actually from Chinese Mahayana Buddhist societies who decided to think more broadly across Southeast Asia in order to have a larger Buddhist connection. And even though Buddhism has been kind of diminishing in Southeast Asia since at least since the advent of Islam in the 14th century, but before the 12th, the 11th century, when Srivijaya was ransacked by the Chola Empire. During this, even though Buddhism has been diminished, except in Chinese communities, you have these new sanghas who really look to different places internationally and across borders to understand themselves as Buddhist citizens. And so this is a very interesting thing. At the introduction and the kind of commemoration for this, you have this Buddhist temple that it had funds raised by Chinese Mahayana believers, with this man on the right, who is the minister of religion, who, of course, Indonesia being the largest Muslim country, was a Muslim functionary. In the area of the Karo Batak, who is a mostly Christian group. And finally, the last thing that I want you to know about the Karo Batak people is that there are many people who are Karo Batak who call themselves Hindus, even though what they mean by Hindus is somebody who worships the old Batak gods, who are called Devata. Now, they wouldn't be understood as Hindus by anyone who knows Hinduism well, but they understand Hinduism as being a way to have an identity behind their older religion, which has elements of Hinduism in it. So all of this taking place together I believe it was in 2011 when it was commemorated. And I think that it's very important to recognize the ways in which religion particularly and religious networks are integrated in these places, especially the further away you get from the center. So the further away you get from Mecca, the more that local understandings of religion can have play. The further away you get from the German missionary, the further away you get, from the center. And so I wanted to finish with a couple of things. So I said at the beginning that I was going to show you another a shrine that was in the Kaliaman temple on Pulau Pinang. This is that. This is called a Datuk Kong. And this is a Chinese shrine that is often housed within the complexes of larger Hindu temples. And it is not just a Chinese shrine. It is connected to Malay understandings of power, which have to do with ancestors and powerful places, particularly high places. You can see this rock in the shrine as being connected to this understanding. The word Datuk means grandfather. And in the Malay area, especially before Islam, the understanding of powerful, magical beings were often connected to physical ancestors. The interesting thing about these shrines, which are still, people still bring offerings to them, mostly Chinese Malay people, but they're housed at a Hindu complex. So that tells you quite a bit. The interesting thing is, for instance, they will make sure that their offerings are halal, because the idea is that the ancestral spirits of the Malay area are more likely to be Muslims. And so you have this, the same type of thing that I showed you with the Shwedagon Pagoda, but this took place in the mid-19th century. There are lots of sources that go even further to before that, as something that happens when you have people with different understandings of power and different genesis and epistemologies for that power who are inhabiting ground together. And so you have these things happening at the same temple. This is an example, I just wanted you to see it, of the Nagore Shrine as it looked in Penang in Malaysia, and you can still go there. I went there and I talked to the sheikh who was there. If you go to the back of the Nagore Shrine, you will see a coffin, although of course the body of the sheikh is in India, not in Penang, but it is as if the presence of the saint was still there. They celebrate his urs, and this is that day where you see the entire dargah looking as if it's a ship sailing. On the other, this is the sheikh, and what is interesting to me here is he's of South Asian descent himself, but he's speaking to a Malay Muslim woman who is certainly from a Sunni background, and there's quite a bit of issue actually between Sufi and Sunni Muslim groups within Malaysia. But she came because her husband had a leg issue that was not able to be healed. And so the sheikh here is reciting verses over this water. And the woman would then take the water home and use it for her husband. So this is an example of the activity that goes on in the in the dargah. And this is an example. I wanted you to see the humans here. So here are some of the humans who through their work and their effort, put together this religious community of a very large mosque called the Kapitan Kling Mosque in Penang, as well as the dargah, which is located just a few blocks away. This is the Nagore Dargah in Singapore. And the interesting thing about this dargah is that it is now a heritage center for Indo-Singaporean groups. Mostly, when we're talking about that, we're mostly talking about Tamil laborers who came in the 19th century. Although being part of the British colony, there's just a large variety of people from different places in India. And I can talk a little bit about that if you'd like. What's interesting is if you go in, the docent of the museum, who does not, I believe, call himself a sheikh, thinks of himself as an interpreter, but there is no coffin for the saint, and he does not want to make this seem as if this is a place of Sufi worship. Instead, it has become a cultural center and a museum as a way to actually avoid some of the controversy of being a dargah within a very Sunni context. This, though, is the reason why you have these dargahs in Singapore and in Penang. The reason is because the Tamil migrants who came from India, from the Coromandel Coast and the Malabar Coast as well, were so grateful for their safe passage. And this is an example of one of the ships. This used to be on an inlet. It is now entirely covered over, and it has become the name of a subway station. But it used to be on an inlet, and the idea was that people would just come off of the sea voyage just absolutely grateful that they got there in their family and their possessions in one piece. And the dargah began there because they would want to have a way to show their gratitude by giving thanks to Allah and to engaging with the sheikh and his legacy of bringing safety across the oceans, because he, the sheikh himself, of course, went between the Middle East to the Maldives, I believe. I believe he went to places in Southeast Asia. He went almost everywhere. And so that was why this dargah sprung up at exactly this place. However, I do want to show that this is not simply an Indian Ocean phenomenon. It has to do with Southeast Asia generally. So this is the Masjid Muhammadiyah, which was actually commissioned by one of the princes, hereditary princes in the Malay area, which looks, of course, like a Chinese temple. And you can see here a conversation between the man who chants the azan, who is a Chinese Muslim, the Malay student who came to pray at this particular mosque. And what you don't see, because he asked not to be in the picture, was a Tamil Hindu taxi driver who had talked to me about his experiences in feeling in Malaysia as if his religion and his identity as being a Hindu, a Tamil Hindu, was entirely under attack. He mentioned issues of, for instance, there being issues if Muslim women married into Hindu families, whereas there would not be issues if Hindu women married into Muslim families. And he himself very clearly felt quite bitter. He was telling me about his experiences. And yet, when we went to the mosque and I asked him if he'd like to come in, or at least, have some water or something like that, you could see him open up, especially at this place where there was very clearly a wide degree of humans in this place. And he actually confessed that he never would have expected that he would have felt comfortable in this place, but he did. And so I want to bring it back to this image that I showed you at the very beginning, where now, even though I had not really thought about the active experiences of Tamil people in North Sumatra right now, although I had thought much more about Tamil trading guilds on the coast of North Sumatra 1,000 years ago. It turned out that when I went to this church, I was going to North Sumatra, and I was visiting my husband's family, who is a Catholic family. And it turned out that the church was actually very, very close to where my sister-in-law lived, and my brother-in-law, which of course I was there by myself, but I needed to stay in their house. There would be no way that I could stay in a hotel. I needed to sleep at least one night in their house. And so I decided to ask if they maybe would help me figure out where this shrine was at the same time. Well, it turns out that this is the place where my sister goes to church. She goes to church here. She knew the friar very, very well. Even though he sang Tamil Christian liturgy, that's how he grew up, they now sang liturgy that was in Indonesian and included some of the musical repertoire of the Toba Batak ethnic group. And so I realized that by holding these things apart in my early fieldwork, I was entirely missing the point, because they were connected in the everyday experiences of the people that I wanted to get to know. So as I said, humility is a crucial element within this type of work. I think I'm going to stop for now to see if there are any questions, and let me figure out how to stop my screen. Oh, I think we have it here. Stop presenting. Okay. Excellent. And I have other slides and things that I could show to you if you're interested. I see now that I spoke much longer than 20 minutes. Apologies.
No problem at all. That's fascinating. Okay. So this is the time to the floor to demolish your doubts and queries, and also come up with a lively discussion with Professor Julia, Amy, and others, many more. So this is the time for discussion, and we have to keep it for some time. You can ask either directly to unmute your mic yourself, or you can text. I can read it for you. So Amy, I would like to start with you. After that, Amy, could you please unmute your mic?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Julia, for that wonderful presentation. It really is great to hear the voices from the field, as you've expressed with the Toba Batak and their incredibly syncretic traditions. I had no idea that was happening. It makes me think of the Islamic cosmopolis of the Indian Ocean that we'll be hearing about from Ronit Ricci in our final talk this year about the traveling of Arabic throughout the Arabic cosmopolis of the Indian Ocean. And we can think about that musically as well, because this happened with music also. We have maqams that came to India, the Hijaz, that became the Maya Malavagala of Carnatic music, the beginning scale that's used in Carnatic music. We have, which is where we also got the Bhairav Rag in North Indian classical music, and so forth, going through all the way to Indonesia. I feel that the Pelog scale and some of its five note modes, pentatonic scales, are very reminiscent of the Hijaz maqam of Arabia, of the Arabian region of Hijaz. And in Carnatic music, they even had, before they had Maya Malavagala, they had a Hijazi, like in the 12th century, I think it was, that this was traveling with the ships. And in Indonesia, as I said, even the vocal style is so reminiscent of the Quranic chant, of the
Absolutely.
Yes. So we have so many connections in a musical sense between these regions that interconnects the Islamic world and the Indian Ocean.
The biggest one that I'm thinking about quite a bit is, of course, the Nobat.
Yes.
We don't have any Nobat Khana here, but the Malays have a Nobat that has a nafiri, a nakara, and is used, for instance, it was used when people would receive letters from other high-ranking dignitaries. It was used when the king was, invested. When the king went out, it was used for the calls to prayer, just as it was in the Deccan Sultanate, just as it was in the Abbasid Caliphate, just as it was everywhere. And yet, what's so interesting is that it took me until I worked on Catherine Schofield's project to recognize that you have sources for the Nobat in, I believe, the 15th century, 14th century in North Sumatra, before the Mughal period. So quite clearly it came from Gujarat, because the interesting from Kambayat, before that port silted up. Because what's interesting is that in the areas of North Sumatra, you have a specific kind of marble that it can only be from Gujarat for the gravestones of some of the sultans. And that came at exactly the same time as the old accounts in which Nobat was first discussed.
Mm-hmm.
So there are many, many, many musical elements, as well as Muharram celebrations that you can connect directly from India through Southeast Asia.
Yes, certainly. Wonderful. I'd like to hear more from Mohammed and Dr. Shibinu about the Mapula tradition.
So just, let me bring this discussion to the Islamic circulation around the Indian Ocean world that will be much interested for Julia Bale also, because I gone through your article and you explicitly explains about the migration that's in 3 phases that happened from India. One in 1842, 1914 migration to the Southeast Asia, and also another migration to Swahili coast. Also, you in your article try to connect with the Swahili coast and the Southeast East Asian region. But I think you missed one region, that is the Malabar and the Mapilas. Because once we are talking about this connection from Africa to Asia to Southeast Asia, and I can explain in a bit more about anthropologically, because once we are talking about the movement of the people from the very early ages, the out of Africa model, from Africa, it connected to the western coast of India, and it finally reached into the Australia. That is why archaeological evidences, we have some of the human specimen from India and also from Australia and also from Africa in similar kind. So from the time immemorial, we have that type of connection, and that connection has been continued even after that. So once we are talking about the monsoon Islam, so there the importance of the Mapilas is very important. And to start my discussion, I can summarize from your talk that ocean is not a place to separate, but a channel to connect. That is why we are always talking about the connected oceans. So I just wanted to recollect the space, memory and imaginations of the Mapilas and also the Arabian Peninsula, because we have a particular genre. It's called the Mapila songs. And that Mapila songs derived out of our contact with the Arabic traditions. And I wonder, one of your important 2 points you mentioned in your lecture, that is Bindu Mathagu and also the Tamil Mandrigam Yendras. We have a similar pattern we use in our Mapila songs, that is known as the Abhijad system. In Malayalam, we can call it as an akkakattu, and in that akkakattu tradition, we actually borrowed from the Abhijad system that is very famous and prevalent among the Arabic poetry. So, you know anything about this Abhijad system or the akkakattu system that practiced by the Mapilas? And is it possible to connect the magical tradition of the Tamil Mandrigam Yandras and the Bindu Mathagu and also with the concept of Abhijad system? That is my question.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because what I've been realizing when I've been looking at this text, I can't answer your question directly because I've not studied the Abjad system myself. But what I can say is that hurufism, so the Sufi metaphysical understanding of the power of the actual Arabic letters, which is what is used in Jawi. So the Toba Batak uses something that is more similar to Telugu, I suppose. But the Jawi is entirely based in Arabic script. You will often find with the Bindu Matogu in Malay, i.e. Muslim context, the word for the Prophet Muhammad, the names of Allah, and sometimes just one letter again and again and again. And of course, I was reminded about this when I was thinking about some of the philosophy of Ibn Arabi when he talks about having a dream in which he marries all of the letters in the alphabet and all of the stars in the sky. So I think it would be very interesting to find out if I could come up with an understanding of this type of efficacious, powerful texts in which it is not about what is said, but it is about how the words show power. And I would imagine that that is probably what you are speaking about with the texts as well. Is it Mapala? Is that correct? So I would love to hear more about that, to figure out, yes, how we could make connections. I will say, from North Sumatra, I was just happy that I knew that the Malabar coast was on the one side and the Coromandel coast was on the other, and I never could remember which side which one was on. Just like you probably don't remember which side Palembang is on and which side Jakarta is on, right? We don't know that. So I was very proud when I even learned the names of those two coasts. The only reason that I happen to know about that Mandrikam literature is because through this Lutheran missionary of Karl Diehl, who worked, I believe, closer to where you are. I'll try to remember the name of the Lutheran city that he worked in, but it wasn't on the Coromandel coast, I don't think. It was only because he happened to see the literature and wrote it down that I knew about this. I'm limited by who I know and what literature I know about. So getting to know about this literature is a wonderful invitation for understanding these texts in a better way. There's no reason why it would not be connected. Why would it be connected to Gujarat and connected to Nagaur, but not connected to anything in between? Of course it's connected. It's just that nobody ever brought it to my knowledge at the point when I was writing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
I'll also say that Ronit Ricci and I were graduate students together. So I could always, we learned Indonesian right next to each other in 1997 and 8 at the University of Michigan. I could have a chat. I could have a chat with her about what she thinks about these textual connections, because I don't mean to privilege, for instance, the churning of the sea of milk. That's important, but so are the stars of Solomon and the seals of Solomon and the important Arabic letters. They're all important. So I would love to have that conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a connective question in my mind that I will come after some time. Is there anybody there to ask any other question? And after that, I will come again.
Ma'am Julia, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Actually, you have mentioned everything, especially the cultural cohesion between different regions as part of movement and the religious practices. See, your article, I want to supplement something with Professor Asif regarding the article that you have shared days before. See, in your article, you have mentioned very clearly that as part of the Indian Ocean studies, the contributions made through different parts of different boundaries of Southeast Asia, South Asia, Oceania, Africa, Middle East, which seems so much significant. It was with example you have mentioned. But my question is, when you have mentioned the cultural cohesion between regions, see, an element, as Seeb has mentioned, you have forgotten to mention. I think I'm mentioning about Malabar region, because Malabar is a beautiful region where we can see the cultural cohesion between different, especially cultural exchange between the pure culture of Malabar with Middle East and vice versa. So we can see that mutual exchange of culture between these two regions. And when I'm mentioning about migration as part of MK Chair for Migration Studies, when I'm dealing with migration, see, one thing I'm curious about is migration is the sole income, and in many years it assumes the remittances is assumes to be around nearly 40% of the total gross domestic product of Kerala, a small state, which assumes so much significance. We are giving so much significance to migration from days immemorable itself. When we are looking at that migration, there happened to be some sort of cultural cohesion between Malabar and other parts of the world, especially the Middle East. Say, for example, if we talk about the cultural synthesis which are being happened in Malabar, especially in the form of the dress habit, especially in the form of the worship, especially in the form of the food culture that Malabar is following. See, there we can see a pure signal of Middle East culture. There is a pure practice of Middle East. And if we look at Malabar, especially the Muslim culture, Malabar is a place where Muslims are predominantly dominating. And if you look at two sides of the roads, you can see innumerable number of innumerable number of Muslim practicing places, worshipping places, and so on. So culture, in all sense, it has been synchronized with Malabar as part of movement. The first thing, and the second aspect is when we look at the cultural aspect, we can mention another thing that is the development of a separate song, a musical genre, which we call it as letter songs. Steve is actually researching on that particular area. See, we can see a letter songs is actually the result of that migration movement. Because when the male member, at that time, earlier time, when because of poverty, migration was compelled, a male member was migrated to the Middle East countries. Why Middle East migration is so much significant? Because at that time, the Muslims were less educated and unskilled. They don't have that much ability to migrate to those places, industrially important places, and they were not able to obtain better living standards, better job there. So they were migrated at that time to Middle East, because Middle East was a place where they were able, even though they were unskilled, they were less educated, they were able to obtain a good job, a productive job. So they were migrated to that place. As part of that migration, a cultural cohesion was happened. I told you earlier. And second aspect is a new type of musical genre was also happened, because if you look at the studies made by Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. So they have a special focus on these letter songs, because letter songs are actually the reflections of the pain of separation between the couples, between the husband and wife, between the husband and the parents, between the husband and the kids. Because in the absence of the male member, the father, the kids have also their own sorrows, because they don't have enough to move, because in the presence of the father, they were able to move the places they like, and they can do some sort of activities. They can travel to some other places for studies, because father will be there at home. But because of his absence, many sacrifices the children are also making. So we can see three categories of letter songs as part of that movement. The emotional separation between husband and wife, emotional separation of the male member from his parents. Actually, parents were old age, they were sick. They also want the presence of the male member. So absence of that creates a lot of problem. And the third category is the pain of separation of father from the children. So these were actually recorded in beautiful ways, because the literal songs, it was written in Arabic Malayalam, and it actually reflected a lot about the pain of separation of these three categories of the stakeholders of migration. So that sort of a cultural cohesion was happened between Kerala, especially with the Middle East. But if Madam Julia will have an interest on this area, definitely our area will also be flourished because of your writing, because of your focus. That is why I'm mentioning about that. Because if you have a curious interest, definitely we can also contribute towards that. We will be all part of that particular side. Definitely, our area of interest can be reflected worldwide. That's why I'm mentioning about. I think I have a curiosity that. Have you mentioned everything? Anything regarding the cultural cohesion between Kerala with the rest of the world in your studies, in your books, or in your literature?
No, I'm realizing, so Jim and I began this and, did reading, but engage with the people who have written, we were limited by what Western musicologists had written, because I could not read, for instance, anything that was written, in Hindi or anything like that. Neither could Jim. And so when we did the call for papers for the conference, we were again limited by who answered the call. As it happens, we don't have anyone from India who answered the call for papers. We have somebody who writes about Karachi and Pakistan and Sri Lanka, but we don't have anyone who answered to write about the Coromandel and Malabar coasts. And so as a result, there were some times when Jim and I said, well, we have to bring India in. We can't write this without it. So that was when we came up with the idea of the Nagaur connection, because it so clearly was in Southeast Asia and on the coast. So at least we were able, it would have been a shame if we would have only talked about Hindu India. So we needed to make sure we talked about Muslim cultures on the coast. But you are absolutely right. There are many, many areas that we did not get to cover. And I wish I could rewrite that article, because that description of the perspective of the people left behind through music is so touching. If you remember, I know exactly where I would have put it in the article. There was a bit where we were talking about the men who sometimes had wives in each port of call, and the connection of the men with these different groups in any of the places where they are. Well, that's from the men's perspective. Even when I was writing that with Jim, I thought, I wish we had the perspective of the women. Where do we get that? Well, now I know that you had it all along and I didn't know. So I'm glad you could tell me now. Perhaps you would be good enough to email me a reading list of what you think I should know, and also maybe even musical examples. I'm not sure we could work it into the book, because we're going through the proofs right now. If I would have been able to know about it even earlier on, I might have sacrificed some words from one place to put it into another place. But at the very least, when I talk about this in the future, I could certainly talk about it. But if you will give me a citation list, I can pass it on to Jim, and a listening list. Again, it's funny to recognize that I've never actually set foot in India. Yet here I am talking about Urdu poetry and about Malayalam medical literature and about Nagaur. It's a bit of cheek, to be honest. A little bit of it's a little bit funny to talk about something that you've never experienced. But I suppose that's the only way we can do Indian Ocean studies. Thank you for letting me know. I will say that from someone who works in North Sumatra, almost no one talks about North Sumatra. I'm not surprised you don't know about this, Dr. Amy, because people talk about Java and Bali, and most people know about Java and Bali, but that's not all there is. So I would always say, oh, wait, there's this other place that's important that you've not heard about. Let me tell you. So I know how it feels. Although, not being from North Sumatra, you probably have a different investment, which I respect. To recognize that anything that we tell is never going to be complete. And that is one reason why Jim and I were very careful in the volume to say, we are not experts on this. We are people who are convening conversations. We hope that we will have corrections once this is read within the areas of the Indian Ocean. We hope that people will write better versions of what we have done once the scholarship is more complete. And it's only more complete once more people have their voices presented. So I'm very glad that you had the chance to bring these to my attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Julia. Professor Asif will share you those details.
Yeah.
Email.
I'm
So
sorry?
Can I speak?
Yeah, Rashid,
Asif?
please. Yeah, please.
Yes, respected Ami Kathleen, Dr. Shibinu, my colleagues Hasib and Julia, you are such a fascinating and wonderful presentation, first of all. And what I thought that, there is quite a bit of a number of books, written, edited by Mahmoud Kuria and Anderson, and Malabar and Indian Ocean. You just share, to ask to share some of the, books about the Indian Ocean and the Malabar. So this Korea is wonderfully, research in this area, especially you already stated about the, the Indonesian archipelago. So the interesting fact is that there is no, you miss that Malabar. What we people believe that the Malabar is the center of all these Indonesian trades, and we believe that this begins from here, and we are in the center of the the southern peninsula of India. So we believe that from the east and south, it is moving from our side, and east and west from our side. We are connected far east to the, what Asif said, East Australia. I don't believe that much of Australia, but at least in Southeast Asia, and the same way into the African, horns. So it's a very wonderful, interesting way you presented. This is the first time the Amis already mentioned about it. What we hear about the, Islamic, word, the monsoon Islam, and that these people are share a common culture, even material system, even food habits, even the language. Of course, you mentioned about the Swahili and some of the connectivity with the Indonesian and so on and so forth. But at the same time, this is the first time we listen about the Christian religion is connecting with this area. The same Islamic world, it is connected by the Christianity, of course, the Buddhism, yes, Hinduism also. So it is a very interesting way you presented, even the architectural shape, or even the migrational, helpful parts, and that in the buildings you just share with us. So I believe that if you're connecting with the Malabar, most of the Malabaris, the Malabari Muslims believe that, whenever the Islam came to Arabia, is the Mecca. At the same time, one of the followers, Prophet Muhammad, who came to India, or the first Islam reached in Malabar. And, we believe that there is a particular shrine or a masjid in southern part of Kerala, northern part of Kerala, that, Malik Dinar tradition. We believe in that one. So when people are missing that Malabar, of course, the person like Asif is, rigorously researching in these areas, and is interesting to know more about all these things from outside India. So I think that this, webinar is a very fruitful one for getting and further information from your side, and also sharing some of our idea about the Malabar as a center of all these Indonesian trade. As a door of Indonesian trade in our sense. Okay, thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for this. I mean, I think I mentioned before the difference between the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Western Indian Ocean. We kept on saying to ourselves, what about Zanzibar? What about South Africa? What about Mozambique? We must have these perspectives because they didn't come naturally to us. It seems to me that if my colleague, Andy Eisenberg, who writes about the Swahili coast and actually writes about Indian musical songs within the Swahili coast, I bet you he would have brought Malabar in. I bet you he would have known to do it. He might have missed North Sumatra. So, it has to do with where you are. It's very interesting to hear about you talking about Malabar as being the first place that Islam kind of really sank in India. The coasts, I believe that 100%, because that's what happens in Sumatra. It's the coastal areas where you have that first. But from my perspective, I think of Aceh, the word Aceh, I mean, Aceh is seen as the veranda of Mecca. So the porch of Mecca, the very first place in all of Southeast Asia to be, to have Islamicization. So it might be interesting to see what a comparative discussion of Malabar and Mecca, Malabar and Aceh might look like, right? I mean, as these places where Islam began first. So, and I'm happy to share with you some of the sources of kind of that very, very first time that the ship came, and the very first sultan was a Raja. His name was Raja Merasalu, and he was converted in a dream, in which the Prophet Muhammad spat on his into his mouth. And then when he woke up, he was a Muslim, and he changed his name to Sultan Ibrahim, I believe, and then he was given the Nobat. So it would be interesting to see what a comparison between Aceh and Malabar would look like, because both places have this narrative as being the first place in a vast area where Islam kind of really took hold. And Acehnese think of themselves as being kind of the models for Islam in Southeast Asia elsewhere. So I would be fine to be excluded from that conversation, to just have a conversation between those who work on Aceh and those who work on Malabar. But I will also say, from my perspective, I'd always thought as the Strait of Malacca, which is that little area between Malaysia and Sumatra, as being the most important Indian Ocean place, because all the trade has to come right through there if it wants to go to China. So not just the Indian Ocean, but between Europe and the Middle East and China, everything has to go right through that tiny little strip. And so it just goes to say that we understand things from where we see, what is close to us, where we're situated, where we're standing. So I really appreciate that new view from Malabar. I can't wait to hear the music. Invite me, I'll come gladly anytime I have research funds. I'd love to set foot on India sometime. I just have to learn some. Let me ask so do you have poetry and poetry recitations kind of like they do throughout Urdu speaking areas? Do you have Urdu poetry as important in your area, or is it entirely different?
Yeah, here a particular
It's
language.
actually entirely different.
Yeah, Arabic Malayalam.
Urdu is
It's not
So it's in Malayalam.
The test is in Arabic, you know. Asif can explain more.
But you have poetic,
that means
you have poetic
Urdu
recitations
is
as
actually,
well.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the
So
Arabic
Urdu
Malayalam,
text
the
is
ballads
not
are
that
sung
much important
poetry.
here.
The Arabic Malayalam
Yeah, I mean, please go ahead.
are sung poetry, the ballads. It's a tremendous wealth of literature, oral literature that is sung, performed. And I'm trying to find out if the Book of 1,000 Questions was ever sung or performed. Looking for current performances, perhaps.
Oh, interesting. Well, the reason I'm asking is because my work on Regula Qureshi has to do with her husband, Salim, who is a Pakistani, who was a Pakistani political scientist, but also a lover of Urdu poetry. He was raised in Lucknow and he knew Urdu poetry like the back of his hand. But then after partition, he felt unwelcome studying there. And so he went to Pakistan and then to the University of Pennsylvania. Most people think of Regula Qureshi and Qawwali music, but she knew Urdu poetry through her husband before she became a scholar. Long time. And she played the sarangi, not just as an accident. Most people play other instruments, but because it's connected with poetry and the voice, and because she played the cello as a performer. And so through her work, I have heard lots and lots of recordings of Urdu poetry gatherings of 40 people in her basement who go back and forth, and they have something called a bait-bazi. Do you know what a bait-bazi is? The back and forth of poetry. Of course, because it's Urdu poetry, it's connected to Islamic poetic and aesthetic elements. So it would be really interesting for me to understand the similarities and the differences with Malayalam Muslim poetry to other poetic traditions within the Muslim world. That's very interesting, especially if it's not in Arabic.
Super. Yeah, Mark, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that excellent presentation, and also for your paper. I'm a scholar of Malabar. I'm just doing my PhD now, but I'm also a part of this project called Recentering Afro-Asia, which I think maybe you might be interested in. It was based at the University of Cape Town and BITS, UWC, mostly in South Africa, but studying the Indian Ocean networks. And so it seems that in your paper you're proposing a framework and a way to study a way to study the Indian Ocean in a collaborative way, right? Because our disciplines and our geographies are broken up in this strange sort of arbitrary way that doesn't seem to actually fit maybe some of the objectives, like studying migration and things like that. I wanted to sort of highlight, maybe instead of, so we're all talking about viewing things from where we stand, and we are the center, and it starts from us, and then it goes into to the other places. And this is natural. I mean, we all have our reasons for it. For example, Malabar was the only place you could get pepper, so we had the network. But maybe the way to I was wondering if you had thought about studying this as a network, and if we were to study it as a network with hubs and with nodes, then would that change the way that we would that change the way that we carry out our scholarship? And also
please continue.
You also brought up these really important things that I feel like that we need to be wary of, which is when we are talking about the first time that we encounter new information, and the first time that we kind of enter a place and start studying it, or even if we're studying our own places and our own cultures and our own domains, we come in with a certain bias or a certain skew or certain sort of ideas that kind of that it's probably not the best thing for rigorous academic work. So our first instincts are they kind of need to be tempered, and the ideal way to temper it maybe would be to have these kind of discussions and be exposed to research from other places that we don't know about, that we haven't heard about. So could you speak more about that? I feel like maybe your thinking has developed since writing this article itself. So is there anything that you would like to add to this? Like, if you could, add to that argument.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was a long time before when we wrote it. And I'll also say that within that article, there are different people with different strengths. So, for instance, Jim knows quite a bit more about migration than I do, because he's worked on the migration, particularly of people to Singapore, and he has that kind of political economic brain. Whereas the bits about comparative ethnomusicology and about, for instance, the connection between Indonesia and Madagascar, that was something that I've been writing about for years. And so it's kind of funny. Jim said, oh, people are going to think I'm really smart and know all about Jaap Kunst. And I said, oh, people are going to think I'm smart and know all about migration. So it's a back and forth between two co-editors to figure out, how to write something. And of course, I mean, I could imagine it not being written at all, because who are we to talk about the Indian Ocean when we've only been in these small little places? But the difficulty is that if you don't write it, then it's not initiated. Who's going to write it? So the main thing that I think is important to keep in mind, and this is only intensified since we've written the book, is that we're not meant to be comprehensive. We are not meant to be a textbook. We are not meant to tell the entire story about the Indian Ocean. Instead, we are meant to frame this and to basically wave our hands and say that this is an important way to think about things. What about, people thinking about things more broadly? This is a rubric in which you could do it. I imagine that having a graduate student who starts to talk about thinking about the Indian Ocean might actually do a much better job than either Jim or I did, being so connected to one specific place. I wonder what it would be like if a graduate student automatically learned 3 different languages and had 3 different field research places. Let's say the Malabar Coast, and let's say Tanzania and Malaysia. It would be very interesting to actually initiate that research in multiple places. It's difficult to do. Only people like Ronit Ricci have actually been able to do this. But it also might be interesting to ask Ronit as well, for instance. Like, for instance, her work really did begin with Java, even though she herself, knowing Hebrew, coming from Israel, was already positioned differently. And then as she grew and got to know different places and texts from different places, how she herself began to incorporate the knowledge that she only knew from afar at the beginning. I have a feeling that this is kind of what is the story for most of us. But the main thing is that I will never want to be understood as an expert in the Indian Ocean. I simply want to be understood as somebody who recognizes that these frames are important, who recognizes, with Jim, it came very clearly, the marginalization of Indian Ocean communities vis-a-vis land-based hegemonies in national situations. That I felt very strongly needed to be flagged. And also embracing the fact that you're not comprehensive, embracing the fact that you have biases by being connected to the Indian Ocean from the east as opposed to the west. This stands in for the impulse of being a master and having a masterwork. Well, that's not possible anymore, and nobody wants to do it anyway. So it's much better to recognize and give people footholds for recognizing the fallibility of your scholarship from the very beginning. I do think networks and nodes would be interesting. I've always thought that it might be interesting to, instead of having 2 editors and 2 initiators, have, let's say, a collaborative article written by people from port cities who work on port cities, for instance, all across. So having a relatively large article with 6 authors with nobody at the helm. It would be a little bit of a disaster to write, but alternative projects in which you don't have 2 people standing as editors might be a way to do this. For instance, I know a scholar that has been talking about writing smaller essays, so 3,000 word essays, but writing with about 7 different people. So their entire voice as a group becomes what people hear, as opposed to any one person kind of getting the credit or the blame for all of the work. So maybe something inherently collaborative would work well in terms of networks and nodes.
Oh,
Thank you.
So thank you, Mark. Anybody else? Before that, one good news. I'm going to present a paper on these migration, emotion, and the Song of the Gulf 5, the upcoming International Conference of Traditional Music World Conference in Ghana.
Oh, excellent. That's a great place to do it.
Yeah.
Wonderful. That's really wonderful. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm going to be there too, Hasib.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. I'll see you there.
I won't be there, unfortunately. I went to Lisbon last time, so I couldn't go again. But maybe I'll be able to see something virtually. I'm not sure. But I'm so happy that you'll be able to meet each other, meet everybody else there and be part of that conversation. I must admit my voice is gone a little bit.
We're going to wrap up the session. Any other question, or we will going to wrap up the session as soon as possible?
Hello, Julia,
before
ma'am.
going to wind up, it would be good for you to sing a song on Letter Song. That would be good.
Me to sing a
Yeah.
song? Okay, well, I'll sing a lullaby. The lullaby because it's time for me to go to sleep. And it's a Malay lullaby, and my voice doesn't really do very well some of the ornamentations, but this is what I would sing to my son if he were here.
Yeah.
Ooh, ready?
Yeah, ready.
So, fruit of my heart, the kind of relations of my soul, sleep, go sleep, go sleep. And then actually, it's about your father not being here. So your father's far from here. There's this word called ranta, which means that you go to the neighboring village. So just depend on me for the moment, son. That sounds pretty similar to some of what you're discussing. So here we go. Buatiku hubungan jiwa, buatiku hubungan jiwa, dodo si dodo ya sayang, ibu dodoikan ya sayang, dodo si dodo ya anak, ibu dodo dia sayang, dodo si dodo, dodo si dodo, janganlah anak suka menangis, janganlah anak suka menangis, ayahmu jauh ya anak, di rantau orang ya sayang, ayahmu jauh ya anak, di rantau orang ya sayang, dodo si dodoy, dodo si dodoy.
Wow.
So that's the mother who's been singing and singing and singing, and her voice is breaking a little bit because
Thank
she's
you, Julia.
That's
That's so if it is possible, we can take one last question from our student, Nuha. Is it possible?
of course.
2 minutes. Yeah, Nuha, please.
Hello, ma'am. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you doing, Anuha?
I'm fine. Actually, ma'am, first of all, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. And I especially love the way you showed us the pictures I really understood all the concepts. And ma'am, it was truly something new. And I didn't have an idea about Northern Sumatra and all these cultures and tradition that you discussed with us. And ma'am, my question is, you've showed us how this different cultural intermixing is going on, and you've been rigorously tracing all these things. So ma'am, with the passing time, does it become more difficult to trace all these things, or is it easy for you with this new technological inventions that are happening around the world to understand all these happenings, or is it getting difficult?
Well, it depends a bit. In terms of the texts that we have, actually, I found that some of them were there from the beginning. Often they were in catalogs that were done by scholars of the 19th or 20th century that are sitting in libraries. And because they're digitized, now we're able to see them. This scholarship is no longer fashionable, philology and Orientalist scholarship. And yet, if you see that as being an access point for some of this literature, it is quite marvelous. And I think we really forget this at our peril. But I will say that it is becoming difficult, especially with there being kind of ascendance of orthodoxy in religions, where often you'll have individuals themselves policing the boundaries of religious belief. That happens in Sumatra for sure, that happens in Malaysia, it happens in other places. The more difficult thing for me is the ethical issue of doing ethnography and seeing the cleavage between the history and the present of what is important to individuals now. On the one hand, you don't want to turn your back to the historical elements. On the other hand, there is something to be said for actually listening to the people who are telling you what is important to them. So as things get further and further apart, a historian wouldn't have this problem, perhaps, but somebody who is an ethnomusicologist and prides themselves in understanding what is important to the autonomy of a musical community, once these things get further and further apart and no longer preserved in living memory, then we have a difficult ethical stance of how much to concentrate on what, and whether this is an academic enterprise or whether it actually is adequately representing how people want themselves to be perceived. So there are different challenges that come up. But luckily, I think ethnomusicologists can be responsive to many different priorities, and that is what I try to do in my scholarship as well. Thank you for the question, though.
Thank you, Julia. And it is quite late to you, so we will going to wrap up this session. Thank you for your fascinating talk, and we're definitely looking forward to continue this discussion with you in near future. We will definitely mail you regarding the migration, emotion, and all these connections with the Maplas.
Wonderful, thank you.
And of course, we can talk more about these connection between the magical aspects of the Mapla songs, especially the Abhijit system. So, as I already mentioned in my talks, that ocean is not a place to detach but to connect, and we always keep this connection together. And of course, thank you, dear Amy, all your effort making these great talks possible. And of course, I thank you, Dr. Shibinu, for making this wonderful event as usual all the time. And thank you, Mark Aranha, for your wonderful discussion, Nuha, and my dear colleague Rashid Kalladi. And I'm thankful to all of you. We will look forward to seeing you again and again in this platform, or in person in our campus, PSMO College. We always welcome you to visit our campus. So with this few words, let me wrap up this session. Thank you. Thank you all.
Goodbye. Bye. Have a good day, everyone.
Yeah, good day. Good night, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.